Hello, everyone. So, Elon Musk sort of stepped into it on Twitter the other day, kind of proving the old adage that just because you're smart in one thing doesn't make you a universal genius. Something I know I need to keep in mind as well, of course. But Musk has been a strong supporter of Ukraine through most of this war, but it appears that the terroristic threats that Putin is engaging in by threatening nuclear warfare is having a partial effect, at least, in that Musk now is apparently afraid of a nuclear strike. And to that end, I don't blame him. The risk isn't nothing. I don't think it's that likely, but it's still more than it was before. Now, I've mentioned recently how capitulating to the demands of a terrorist threatening a nuke strike only emboldens more terrorists to threaten nukes more frequently. So I'm not going to rehash that here. I just want instead to examine some of the claims that Musk put forth about Crimea specifically in the infamous tweet. So Musk stated in his proposed peace deal that Crimea would be, and I quote here, formally part of Russia as it has been since 1783 until Khrushchev's mistake, end quote. Let's pretend for a moment that it was a mistake for Khrushchev to grant Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which is what happened back in 1954 when the USSR was still a thing. Mistake or not, that still means that the government in charge that would later become Russia, of its own volition, gave up their claims to the territory as being intrinsically Russian at that point. Basically, they said, we don't want that territory as part of us, it's part of Ukraine. And not only that, but part of the reasoning that they published at the time, clear back in 1954, was because of, and again, I'm going to quote this, because of the territorial proximity of Crimea to Ukraine, the commonalities of their economies, and the close agricultural and cultural ties between the Crimean Oblast and the UkrSS. Now, that last bit is the short form of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, as pronounced using the acronyms from the Russian Cyrillic letters. Anyway, not a big deal. But just reading that, I mean, again, you can complain it was a mistake, but that doesn't undo the reality. It doesn't undo the claims that were put forth saying that Crimea is more Ukrainian than Russian. They acknowledged that in 1954. And it's not like history ended at that point. 37 years later, in 1991, Ukraine held a vote on whether to remove itself from the USSR. All oblasts of Ukraine, including Crimea, voted to do so. In fact, while Crimea did have the largest vote against leaving the USSR, more than 58% of its citizens at that time did vote to leave the USSR. And Crimea remained part of Ukraine ever since. It was acknowledged even by the Russian government at the time. So in fact, you can see from the percentages here of those who voted no in this graphic from Wikipedia that even Luhansk and Donetsk couldn't get more than 13% opposed. So it's also important to remember that when this election was held in 1991, you didn't have armed Russian Federation troops at the polls, and the citizens voting didn't risk being tortured to death if they voted the wrong way. When fair and free elections were held, the supposed pro-Russian oblasts of Ukraine all voted to leave Russia and to stay in Ukraine and keep that separation intact. Now, this is just a historical fact. You can't undo history. A Russian tyrant threatening to nuke the world if he doesn't get his way doesn't change the reality that Crimea is Ukraine, just as all the other oblasts are Ukraine. Giving up a single inch to Putin because of his terrorism and continual war crimes only incentivizes more of the same. But bear this in mind if you still think that we need to pressure Ukraine into giving up territory. Not only are you caving into tyranny yourself, you are opposing the will of the people on the ground there. And that makes you just as much of a tyrant.